Welcome to the Rehabilitation Services Administration training on the requirements for submission of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Unified and Combined State Plan for program year 2024. This training includes the redesigned vocational rehabilitation services portion of the state plan. My name is Terry Martin, Technical Assistance Specialist with the RSA Technical Assistance Unit. Thank you for taking the time to attend this training. The PowerPoint presentation associated with this training can be located on the National Clearinghouse of Rehabilitation Training Materials website. A link to this PowerPoint is available in the YouTube description below. Please send any questions related to this training to your RSA State Liaison. During this training, you will hear from the following presenters from RSA. April Trice, a VR program specialist who has been with RSA for 8 years. Jim Doyle, a VR program specialist and state team facilitator who has been with RSA for 16 years. In addition, Jim serves on the Interagency State Plan Steering Committee. Michelle Mulhern, a VR program specialist with over 16 years of experience in the VR program. She is from the state of Washington and has been with RSA for 1 year. Shannon Moeller, a VR program specialist and state team facilitator who has been with RSA for 7 years. Shannon also serves on the Interagency State Plan Steering Committee. And Shelley Hedren, a VR program specialist who has been with RSA for 2 years. She came from the VR program from Nevada, where she was the director for 10 years. Let's begin with Shelley Hedren.
Thank you, Terry. Let's begin by going over the training agenda. We will have a brief introduction and overview of information related to program year 2024 state plan submission, training, and guidance. Next, we will discuss the information collection request, or ICR, for the state plan, followed by information on the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act state plan requirements. Then an overview of required submissions and updates to the VR services portion of the state plan, including statutorily required updates, the descriptions reflecting on the current administration of the VR program, and a step-by-step review of the descriptions A through L. Following the descriptions, we will discuss state plan assurances and state plan certifications. The training will then cover requirements related to the new General Education Provisions Act, GEPA, Section 427 form, which is a required part of the 2024 state plan submission. Next, we will present information on the WIOA performance indicators and the negotiations for them for program years 2024 and 2025. Lastly, we will provide some general information about the common elements of the Unified and Combined State Plans. Joint guidance from the Departments of Education and Labor will be released this fall and will include the submission deadline of the Unified and Combined State Plans. Once the joint guidance is released, the State Plan Steering Committee will develop training, tools, and/or guidance for users of the WIOA State Plan portal as needed. The new Information Collection Request, ICR document, that outlines the requirements for the Unified and Combined State Plan submission for 2024 was published on March 31st under OMB control number 1205-0522. The ICR was emailed on the RSA listserv on May 16th, and it can also be located on the Department of Labor's website. RSA created a work group using representatives from VR agencies, including combined general and blind agencies from across the country, to redesign the VR services portion of the state plan. The consensus of the work group is that the VR services portion is much more streamlined, avoids duplication, and the descriptions and assurances are organized better to align with the plan. And we hope you'll agree. We will now move on to WIOA Unified and Combined State Plan requirements. As a reminder, the Unified State Plan must include the WIOA 6 core programs: adult, dislocated worker, and youth programs under Title I, the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act program, or Title II, the Wagner-Peiser Act Employment Services Program, Title III, and of course, the Vocational Rehabilitation Program, which is Title IV. A combined state plan requires one or more partners in addition to the 6 core program partners. The partner programs that could be included in a combined state plan are listed in the ICR. One example is the Career and Technical Education Programs, CTE, authorized under the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act of 2006. If your state plan submission includes that partner program or any of those listed in the ICR, in addition to the 6 core program partners, then you are submitting a combined state plan. Joint guidance is expected to be released this fall. In the meantime, the ICR is a very good reference to use regarding the required contents of the 2024 Unified and Combined State Plans. Moving on to the VR services portion of the state plan regarding required submission and updates. The Rehabilitation Act requires VR agencies to submit a state plan annually. The Rehabilitation Act provides some authority to the RSA Commissioner to determine the time and the manner of this submission. Therefore, the Commissioner exercised that authority and determined that it would be appropriate for these state plan submissions to align with the required state plan submissions within WIOA, which is every 4 years with a 2-year modified state plan submission in between. Due to the authority granted to RSA under the Rehabilitation Act, RSA was able to align the VR state plan submission with the WIOA Unified and Combined State Plan submission every 2 years. Let's discuss statutorily required updates. State plans are required to be submitted every 4 years, with a modification required every 2 years. Some of the descriptions within the VR services portion of the state plan must be submitted and approved prior to being implemented in the VR program. Sometimes VR agencies must amend or otherwise update the VR services portion of the state plan in an alternate year from the 2-year cycle. Depending on how substantive the information is, it could require an update, a modification, or an amendment. One example is if the Comprehensive Statewide Needs Assessment, CSNA, is completed in the year after state plan submission. This would require an alternate year administrative update. However, if an agency is considering going into an order of selection, that would require a state plan amendment, since it would be a substantive change. Amendments to the state plan require public meetings prior to inclusion in the state plan. Non-substantive updates do not. Both of these examples, however, require updates to the state plan if they occur between the 2-year submission cycle. Each description for each element is based upon a program year, July 1st to June 30th, unless otherwise indicated. In fact, the only element whose response must be based upon federal fiscal year is description F, the annual estimates. State plan submissions for program year 2024 are statutorily required to include updates to the following descriptions: A, C, D, E, F, G, and I. Notice missing from this list are the descriptions B, H, J, K, and L. And note the new ICR only has descriptions A through L. Continuing the VR services portion of the state plan, let's discuss descriptions reflecting the current administration of the VR program. Updating the descriptions B, H, J, K, and L is optional, dependent upon whether or not they reflect the current administration of the VR program. For example, Description H, waiver of statewide-ness. If an agency has a new third-party cooperative arrangement since the last state plan submission that requires a waiver of statewide-ness, it would need to update H requesting the waiver. Next, you'll be hearing from Jim Doyle.
Thank you, Shelley. We will now review the layout and content for Description A, input of the State Rehabilitation Council. Description A, as before, requires the input of the State Rehabilitation Council, or SRC, for all VR agencies required to maintain an SRC. VR agencies that have an independent consumer-controlled commission and do not have an SRC are not required to complete this description. According to data from the 2022 state plans, 11 VR agencies have independent commissions. For VR agencies that have an SRC, this description must be updated each time the VR portion of the state plan is submitted. The primary purpose of Description A remains the need for VR agencies to obtain and document the input of the SRC concerning the development of the state plan and identify any recommendations provided by the SRC. In addition, the VR agency must respond to each recommendation and provide a reason or justification if the VR agency disagrees with any of the SRC's recommendations. Previously, the VR agency would identify whether the agency has an SRC or if it was an independent commission under the assurance section of the VR portion of the state plan, specifically Assurance 3B. Under the new format of the VR portion of the state plan, this designation is identified under Description A by selecting either Option A, the VR agency has an independent state commission, or Option B, the VR agency has established a State Rehabilitation Council. If Option B is selected, the remainder of Description A must be completed. The most significant change to Description A is the inclusion of the table to identify the active members of the council, which term is being served, and when the term began. The purpose of this table is to assist VR agencies identify potential gaps with the council's representation that may be vacant or approaching expiration, and allow the agencies to draw the attention of the appointing official. For each member of the SRC, the VR agency should identify whether the representative is serving its first or second term and when that term began. If a representative role is not active, the agency would indicate vacant under the current term number column. An example of how this new table could be filled out is displayed on the screen using red text. The VR agency identified multiple members serving the first term, some serving their second term, with the date of an appointment by including the month and year for that term. For several representatives, the agency indicated the position is currently vacant and one position, Section 121 Director, as not being applicable in this example. If there were additional representatives serving on the board for the roles not listed, the VR agency could include the positions using the blank lines at the end of the table. For Description A3, the VR agency would indicate whether the SRC is meeting quarterly, and if not fully constituted, what steps the agency will be taking to get its SRC fully compliant. For example, if the SRC has 3 vacant positions, the agency could indicate that the nominations have been submitted to the governor's office or the appointing official in the state, and it is waiting for appointments to be approved. RSA hopes the additional attention in this matter will benefit the DSU to maintain its council. For Description A4 and 5, the VR agency would include a summary of the SRC's input into the state plan and other relevant feedback from the council, including how this input was received from the council. The VR agency would clearly state whether it agrees with the input from the council or if it rejects any of the input from the council. If the VR agency disagrees with any of the input or recommendations provided, it must include why it's not in agreement with the council. RSA believes that additional attention to the status of the SRC and its input will elevate the council and further empower its members. Next, April Trice will be presenting Description B, Comprehensive Statewide Needs Assessment.
Thank you, Jim. In Description B, Comprehensive Statewide Needs Assessment, Sections 101A, 15, 17, and 23 of the Rehabilitation Act require VR agencies to provide an assessment of the rehabilitation needs of individuals with disabilities residing within the state. This description must include A, individuals with the most significant disabilities, including their need for supported employment services. B, individuals with disabilities who are minorities, underserved, or unserved. C, individuals served through the state workforce development system. And D, youth with disabilities, including students with disabilities and their need for pre-employment transition services. States must also include an assessment of the needs of individuals with disabilities for transition, career services, and pre-employment transition services, and the extent to which such services are coordinated with transition services provided under IDEA. States must also identify the need to establish, develop, or improve community rehabilitation programs within the state. When developing this description, states must also consider the following. Description B must be based on program year. VR agencies should update this description as appropriate if the comprehensive statewide needs assessment was conducted since the submission or modification of the prior state plan. VR agencies are not required to include the full report of the comprehensive statewide needs assessment in this description, but should thoroughly and clearly summarize the results of the comprehensive statewide needs assessment, since this information serves as a foundation for the development of Description D, goals, priorities, and strategies. Newly established, developed, or improved community rehabilitation programs must be consistent with the development and implementation of innovation and expansion activities, and should be consistent with prior approval requests related to these types of activities and projects. I will now hand things over to Shannon Moeller.
Thank you, April. Let's discuss Description C, Goals, Priorities, and Strategies. This description will now include the strategies or methods used to achieve each goal or priority. Goals and priorities must be jointly developed and agreed to by the SRC and must be measurable. The goals, priorities, and strategies must be consistent with the most recent CSNA, Description B. Agencies must describe as applicable strategies or methods to 1. Support innovation and expansion activities. 2. Overcome barriers to accessing VR and supported employment services. 3. Improve and expand VR services for students with disabilities. And 4. Improve performance related to helping individuals with disabilities achieve quality employment outcomes. This description must be developed for the next 2 program years and amended when there are changes, such as establishment projects, updates to CSNA. Displayed is a section of Description C, Goals, Priorities, and Strategies, taken directly from the ICR. When developing the narrative for this description, VR agency staff must consider the following. The goals and priorities must reflect the next 2 program years, which would be program years 2024 and 2025. The goals and priorities must be based on 1. The most recent CSNA from Description B, 2. The state's performance under the Performance Accountability Measures of Section 116 of WIOA, and 3. Other available information on the operation and effectiveness of the VR program, including any reports received from the SRC and findings and recommendations from monitoring activities conducted under Section 107 of the Rehabilitation Act. VR agencies must describe how the SRC and the VR agency jointly developed and agreed to the goals and priorities, and any revisions. Continuing with Description C, taken directly from the ICR. When developing this description, states must also consider the following. The description must include planned funding for the State Rehabilitation Council, Statewide Independent Living Council, SILC, other areas as applicable, under C2A, Support Innovation and Expansion Activities. State agencies should determine if I&D services are truly I&D services under 34 CFR Section 361.35. Agencies must avoid including not applicable for any of the elements. Responses should be well thought out and include the reasoning behind the narrative entry. Agencies should include any establishment projects planned for the next 2 years. It could save time to address in the plan now rather than do a plan amendment later. When crafting goals and priorities, the agency must consider how it will be able to determine whether the goal has been achieved when the time arrives to report progress. It is always easier to evaluate goals that are measurable. Moving on to Description D, Evaluation and Reports of Progress, VR and Supported Employment Goals. VR agencies are required to describe their progress on achieving goals and priorities identified in the most recently completed program year, performance on federal accountability indicators under Section 116 of WIOA, and the use of funds reserved for innovation and expansion activities. For PY 2024, this will require agencies to look back at the goals and priorities identified in the PY 2022 state plan, descriptions L, goals and priorities, and N, goals and plans for distribution of Title VI funds. Agencies should indicate whether goals are continuing into the next program year, are being revised, or are being retired based on information gathered through the CSNA. Even though the state plan is updated every 2 years, VR agencies must also gather and analyze this data on an annual basis. Displayed is Description D, Evaluation and Reports of Progress, VR and Supported Employment Goals, taken from the ICR. When developing the narrative for this description, VR agencies should ensure that it is providing an evaluation of supported employment goals as well as those for the overall VR program. Ensure it clearly identifies the VR and supported employment goals on which the agency is reporting. For PY 2024, Ensure the goals are linked to specific strategies identified in Description O, States Strategies. Agencies are encouraged to have internal controls in place to evaluate goals and priorities each year. Next is Description E, Supported Employment Services, Distribution of Title VI funds, and arrangements and cooperative agreements for the provision of supported employment services. VR agencies must now indicate if it requests to receive Title VI funds or if it does not elect to receive Title VI funds, and understands that supported employment services must still be provided under Title I by selecting the appropriate button. If a VR agency indicates it has elected to receive Title VI funds, it must include specific goals and priorities with respect to the distribution of Title VI funds for the provision of supported employment services, Description E2. Agencies must include these updates with each submission every 4 years and modification every 2 years of the state plan. VR agencies must also gather and analyze this data on an annual basis. Regardless of the button selected in Description E3, the VR agency must describe the quality, scope, and extent of supported employment services to be provided to individuals with the most significant disabilities, including youth with the most significant disabilities, and the timing of transition to extended services, and describe efforts to identify and arrange, including entering into cooperative agreements with other state agencies and other appropriate entities in order to provide supported employment services. Update when content has changed from the prior state plan. VR agencies must also provide a clear description of how extended services will be provided in supported employment cooperative agreements, Description E4. This should be updated when content has changed from the prior state plan. Displayed is a section of Description E, Supported Employment Services, Distribution of Title VI funds, and arrangements and cooperative agreements for the provision of supported employment services, taken from the ICR. States should consider the following when developing this description. Goals and plans must be based on program year and not federal fiscal year. Goals must be achievable and easily measured or assessed in terms of progress made by the agency. The description must describe activities that will be conducted with the funds reserved for youth with the most significant disabilities, which are provided under the SEA award. Agencies must not spend SEA without also spending SEB. Continuing with Description E, taken from the ICR, it is important to note that the VR agency can describe its supported employment program in its entirety, including the range and scope of these services, partnerships established to provide or enhance these services, and the manner and timing of the transition from supported to extended services. VR agencies must also describe efforts to identify and arrange, including entering into cooperative agreements with other state agencies and other appropriate entities in order to provide supported employment services. VR agencies must describe how they will leverage other public and private funds to increase resources for extended services and expanded supported employment opportunities for youth with the most significant disabilities, and extended services provided to adults must be provided by state appropriations, Supported employment services are provided by the VR agency for a period of not more than 24 months, unless, under special circumstances, the eligible individual and the rehabilitation counselor jointly agree to extend the time to achieve the employment outcome identified in the IPE. Ongoing services are furnished by the VR agency using funds under the Supported Employment Program and/or the VR program from the time of job placement until the transition to extended services, and thereafter by one or more extended service providers, including the VR agency, in accordance with 34 CFR Section 363(4)(a)(2), throughout the individual's term of employment in a particular job placement. Funds allotted under the Supported Employment Program or the VR program may be used to provide extended services to youth with the most significant disabilities as authorized under Section 604(b)(2) of the Act. However, extended services may not be provided by the VR agency using funds allotted under either the Supported Employment Program or the VR program to an individual who is not a youth with a disability. The agency may provide supported employment extended services to youth with the most significant disabilities for a period not to exceed 4 years, or until a youth reaches the age of 25 and is no longer considered a youth with a disability, whichever occurs first. Jim will now discuss the following description.
Thank you, Shannon. Next, we will discuss description F, annual estimates. Some of you may recall the annual estimates description was previously included under description K of the VR portion of the state plan and was moved up in the state plan in part due to the significance of this information. This description includes changes and must be submitted with each new or modified state plan. As before, this description is the only description that requires the agency to submit its information for the federal fiscal year and not the program year, with the possible exception of description for order of selection, which we will discuss later in this presentation. It should also be noted that although this information is required to be submitted every 2 years, the VR agency must conduct a full assessment of its annual estimates each year before the start of the federal fiscal year to determine whether it has sufficient fiscal resources in addition to its other resources to serve all eligible individuals in the state for the next federal fiscal year. It is essential for VR agencies to complete a comprehensive and accurate assessment of its resources to determine not only if it has sufficient resources to serve all eligible individuals, but ensure the agency does not have an abundance of resources, that is, carryover of the full or most of its award, so it can make the necessary adjustments at the start or prior to the start of the federal fiscal year and make the necessary adjustments to areas that include, but are not limited to, its order of selection, cost containment policies and procedures, or additional areas affecting the cost for the provision of VR services. The table under this portion of the annual estimates description has been designed to identify the expected costs for eligible individuals served using its VR funds. If the VR agency is not under an order of selection, it may include only one row under this table for all eligible individuals expected to be served under the VR program, with the numbers served under supported employment program identified separately. However, if the VR agency is not under an order of selection, but chooses to maintain its priority policies, such categorizing individuals as disabled, significantly disabled, and most significantly disabled, it would include a row for each priority category for all individuals expected to be determined eligible. For each priority category, the VR agency should identify the expected number of eligible individuals, the number of individuals expected to receive VR services under the VR program, and the expected cost of VR services using the total cost for each priority category, and identify the number of eligible individuals expected not to receive services due to being placed on a wait list. Please note, this last column is not intended to identify those that exit the VR system prior to an IPE due to attrition, but rather those placed on a wait list. Also, for the expected cost of services, it is preferred if agencies include the total amount of funds that are expected to be used to serve each category and not the average cost per case. Next, let's identify the number of individuals expected to be served through the Supported Employment Program. Regardless of whether the agency is under an order of selection or chooses not to receive its supported employment grants, the VR agency must identify the expected number of individuals eligible for services under the Supported Employment Program, the number of individuals expected to receive supported employment services, and the expected total cost of services. Unless all priority categories are closed, the last column should be 0 or left blank. Also, when determining the expected cost, the VR agency would not limit this information to only Title VI funds, but would include both Title I and Title VI funds expected to be used to serve all individuals with a supported employment plan. Next, we will discuss Description G, Order of Selection. This description includes information pertaining to the order of selection, includes a number of unique changes intended to streamline the information required by all VR agencies. Previously, the VR agency would indicate as to whether the agency would be able to serve all eligible individuals at Assurance 4C, and if not, the VR agency would identify and include all information regarding its order of selection at Description M. Using the revised version, VR agencies will identify whether they are able to serve all eligible individuals for the next program year with Description G, along with their order of selection policies. Under the new format, all VR agencies must identify whether the agency is able to serve all eligible individuals for the next program year by selecting options A or B. If the VR agency is able to serve all individuals and not implementing an order selection, it would select option A. The VR agency is not implementing an order of selection and all eligible individuals will be served. However, if the VR agency cannot serve all eligible individuals, the agency would select option B. The VR agency is implementing an order of selection with one or more priority categories closed. VR agencies will note the wording used for this option is intended to clarify that if an agency is able to serve all eligible individuals and does not expect to have anyone on a wait list, the agency would not be implementing an order of selection. Only if one or more priority categories are closed would the agency indicate that it is implementing an order of selection and choose option B. Under the second part of Description G, the VR agency would include its priority categories regardless if the agency has an order of selection policy. The reason this was included is because often VR agencies will identify whether an eligible individual is an individual with a significant disability or an individual with the most significant disability, regardless if it's under an order of selection, so it can maintain this categorization for individuals receiving supported employment services and extended services for youth with the most significant disabilities. So maintaining its priority categories makes a lot of sense, although all eligible individuals would be able to receive VR services and not be placed on a wait list. If VR agency is not an order of selection, but maintained in its priority categories. The agency should also indicate this under 2A of this section, justification, by stating no order of selection is being implemented at this time. Finally, for description in G3, when identifying whether the agency opts to serve outside the order of selection to assist individuals who require a service or equipment to maintain employment, the VR agency would only indicate yes or no with no additional description needed. Next, Michelle will be reviewing description H, waiver of statewide-ness.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share information about description H, statewide-ness. Some of you may recall the statewide-ness section in previous versions. It was the assurance 3G and descriptions B, 1, 2, and 3. As mentioned at the beginning of the training, updating this element is optional and is dependent on whether it reflects the state's current administration. The VR services portion of the Unified and Combined State Plan must assure that services provided under the VR services portion of the Unified and Combined State Plan will be available in all political subdivisions of the state, unless there is a requested and approved waiver of statewide-ness. RSA must approve a waiver of statewide-ness prior to the VR agency's initiation of a service when a VR service is not available in all political subdivisions of a state. If the VR agency is requesting a waiver of statewide-ness or has a previously approved waiver of statewide-ness, it must describe the types of services, the local entities providing such services under the waiver of statewide-ness, and how the agency has complied with the requirements in 34 CFR Section 361.26. This description must also include all waivers previously approved that are still in effect. No longer requiring a yes/no answer, if the VR agency is not requesting or maintaining an approved waiver of statewide-ness, it must indicate not applicable in the text box. For states requesting a waiver or including a prior approved waiver that is still in effect, make sure the description is as detailed as possible. For instance, rather than simply stating that the project will provide pre-employment transition services, it must identify the specific services that will be provided to students with disabilities, such as work-based learning experiences. Ensure the description includes how the local public agency will make the non-federal share funds available to the VR agency. It should include how the services are expected to lead to or contribute to the vocational rehabilitation of a larger number of individuals with disabilities or individuals with a specific type of disabilities. Ensure the description indicates that each proposed service will be approved prior to its implementation, and, if applicable, make sure that it indicates how the agency's order of selection requirements will be applied. Note that this description must be updated as needed to include any new projects for which the VR agency is required to request a waiver of statewide-ness. And now I'll hand it back to Shelley.
Thank you, Michelle. Moving on to description I, the Comprehensive System of Personnel Development, CSPD. This is a lengthy description. The Rehabilitation Act and its implementing regulations require that VR agencies describe how they will ensure they have an adequate supply of qualified rehabilitation professionals and paraprofessionals. Notice there are 5 parts under number 1 that must be addressed in your response, A through E. The new design for the VR services portion of the state plan includes a new table where you enter your responses to A, B, and C of this element. I will show you that table shortly. For now, please note that number 1, letter A, requests personnel currently employed, currently working, minus any vacancies by type. B, requests the number of personnel currently needed by the VR agency by type. This could include totals for each position if all vacancies were filled. Or agencies may determine the ideal number of staff currently needed by an analysis of the current number of consumers being served, caseload sizes, case age, and other factors that the VR agency determines relevant. C, requests projections for these same personnel categories by type that the agency contends it will need in 5 years to serve its projected number of consumers. D and E provide the analysis needed to respond to C, and responses to D and E must also be provided in the portal, but those responses will be into text boxes and not part of the new table. D is the ratio of VR counselors to consumers, and E is the projected number of individuals with disabilities to be served in the VR program in 5 years. So there's a lot to consider for D and E in order to enter your projection for C. Displayed is an illustration of the new table that was added to the portal for the VR services portion of the state plan for description I, letters A through C. I have entered some random data in red font to illustrate the new table and provide examples of the types of information that would need to be included in your responses. Again, notice that D and E are not included in this table. The ratio of qualified VR counselors to consumers and the projected number of individuals with disabilities to be served in 5 years. Both are required to be included in the state plan submission in individual text boxes for each. And both are needed for you to reach your projections total in the last column of this table for C. Some tools that may help you project the number of consumers you will have in 5 years, and thus the number of staff you will need, include information at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics at bls.gov and disabilities data from Neidler's Compendium at disabilitycompendium.org. For description I, number 2A, here is where you are asked to list the institutions of higher education in your state that prepare VR professionals for the field, the number of students enrolled in each of those institutions' VR degree programs, broken down by the type of program, and the number of students who graduated during the prior year from each of those institutions' VR degree programs. Using the displayed table as an example, I borrowed this information from Michigan's last state plan submission. The data displayed in red text has been included here to illustrate how this will look in the portal and what is required. You can see that there are 3 universities in Michigan that offer counseling master's degrees, the number of students enrolled in each, and the number graduated from each in the prior year. These are the total number of enrollees and graduates of the university's VR degree programs, not totals of VR agency staff that are enrollees or graduates in the university's programs. This is a common mistake. I hope you are seeing the distinction between each of these parts to description I. 2B is requesting agencies' plans for recruitment, preparation, and retention of qualified VR personnel and how agencies coordinate with institutions of higher education and other entities like professional associations in order to recruit, prepare, and retain qualified individuals. Responses should specifically include plans to address the VR program's current and projected needs for recruitment and retention of qualified personnel. Also, that last line says, quote, including personnel from minority backgrounds and personnel who are individuals with disabilities, end quote. Agencies' recruitment and retention plans must include details on how the agency will recruit and retain staff who are from minority backgrounds and who are individuals with disabilities. For element I to C, there are two parts to 2C. Instead of recruitment and retention, this part requests that agencies describe staff development policies, procedures, and activities that ensure current staff have adequate training. 2CI includes very specific topics for which VR programs must provide staff training, including assessment, vocational counseling, job placement, and rehabilitation technology, which requests further detailed information to include staff training in coordination with other programs under the Assistive Technology Act of 1998. 2CII is a part that's very often overlooked in agency state plan submissions. This part requests a description of the procedures for acquisition and dissemination of significant knowledge from research and other sources to VR agency staff. Be sure to address how information is acquired and how it's disseminated, which could include at regularly scheduled meetings, via email, or as part of staff training. Significant knowledge includes best practices and results from research, such as NIDLR's research projects. Just when you thought you were done with the comprehensive system of personnel development, I have a bit more to cover regarding description I. Number 3 under description I has two parts. The first part requests policies and procedures for the establishment and maintenance of personnel standards that ensure a professional level of trained and prepared VR staff. These policies and procedures for establishment and maintenance of personnel standards are likely your human resources policies and procedures for the classifications of your professional and paraprofessional staff as determined by your state. But they could also include your staff work performance standards. 3A requests agencies to discuss how their personnel standards align with any national or state approved or recognized certification, licensing, or other comparable requirements that apply to the profession in which such personnel are providing VR services. 3B asks about personnel requirements for the often overlooked, quote, 21st century understanding of the evolving labor force and needs of individuals with disabilities, end quote, which comes from the amendments to the Rehabilitation Act within WIOA. Specifically, how is this personnel requirement part of your personnel policies and procedures? For example, it could be included in your staff's work performance standards. Lastly, description I, number 4, requests the methods VR agencies use to ensure personnel can communicate in appropriate modes of communication with or in the native language of applicants or eligible individuals who have limited English speaking ability. Your description could include the various languages spoken by VR staff, including American Sign Language, ASL, and additionally, the access that staff have to other personnel or service providers that provide language translation or interpreter services. Number 5 includes the procedures and activities to coordinate VR personnel development with personnel development under IDEA. For example, this could include planned joint training with special education staff. Notice on number 5, it says as appropriate. If this is not something you coordinate, you just need to indicate not applicable in the description for this part. Next, you'll hear from April Trice.
Thank you, Shelley. In description J, coordination with education officials, Section 101A 11D of the Rehabilitation Act requires VR agencies to describe plans, policies, and procedures for coordination between the designated state agency and education officials responsible for the public education of students with disabilities that are designed to facilitate the transition of the students with disabilities from the receipt of educational services in school to the receipt of vocational rehabilitation services, including pre-employment transition services. States must also describe the current status and scope of the formal interagency agreement between the VR agency and the state educational agency. Consistent with the requirements of the formal interagency agreement pursuant to 34 CFR section 361.22b, provide at a minimum the following information about the agreement. A, consultation and technical assistance, which may be provided using alternative means for meeting participation, such as video conferences and conference calls, to assist educational agencies planning for the transition of students with disabilities from school to post-school activities, including pre-employment transition services and other vocational rehabilitation services. B, transition planning by personnel of the designated state agency and educational agency personnel for students with disabilities that facilitates the development and implementation of their individualized education program, or IEPs, under Section 614D of the Individuals with Disabilities Act. C, the roles and responsibilities, including financial responsibilities of each agency, including provisions for determining state lead agencies and qualified personnel responsible for transition services and pre-employment transition services. D, procedures for outreach to and identification of students with disabilities who need transition services and pre-employment transition services. Outreach to these students should occur as early as possible during the transition planning process and must include, at a minimum, a description of the purpose of the vocational rehabilitation program, eligibility requirements, application procedures, and scope of services that may be provided to eligible individuals. E, coordination necessary to satisfy documentation requirements set forth in 34 CFR Part 397 regarding students and youth with disabilities who are seeking subminimum wage employment. And F, assurance that in accordance with 34 CFR Section 397.31, neither the state educational agency nor the local educational agency will enter into a contract or other arrangement with an entity as defined in 34 CFR Section 397.5D. for the purpose of operating a program under which youth with a disability is engaged in work compensated at subminimum wage. When developing this description, states must consider the following. The description must be based on program year and should be updated when content has changed from the prior state plan. The discernible differences in the terminology when discussing students with disabilities and youth with a disability, particularly in the context of pre-employment transition services. Therefore, when discussing pre-employment transition services, VR agencies must use students with disabilities rather than youth with a disability. To refresh your understanding of these definitions, the definition of a student with a disability can be found at 34 CFR Section 361.5 C51. The definition of a youth with a disability can be found at 34 CFR Section 361.5 C58. Should your state have already phased out the subminimum wage or is planning to do so, please provide a brief explanation regarding the timing of this change. In addition, include a link in this description to the legislation that outlines the enactment of this law. I will now hand things back to Shelley to discuss the next description.
Thank you, April. Description K, coordination with employers. Description K requires a description of VR agency's coordination with employers in the state and specifically working with employers to identify opportunities for competitive integrated employment and career exploration opportunities. This includes for all populations and specifically for students with disabilities. The description should go beyond describing job development and job placement services. Rather, Element K is asking how the VR agency will work with employers on the front end to establish opportunities, such as jobs and work-based learning experiences, as opposed to just on the back end when a consumer is job ready and looking for work and an employer is contacted. Both should be included in your description. The emphasis in Description K is working with employers to identify opportunities for competitive integrated employment and work-based learning experiences. Since updates to this element are optional, your responses will be dependent upon whether the description is still a reflection of the agency's current administration. Keeping in the vein of cooperation and collaboration, Description L is requiring a discussion of the cooperation between the VR agency and each of these enumerated partners 1 through 9, and the utilization of the partner services and facilities of each by VR agencies or VR consumers that creates opportunities for competitive integrated employment. For each, it's important to address cooperation with the partner and utilization of the partner services and facilities toward competitive integrated employment. Use that lens in your responses for each of the 9 partner programs listed under this description. Number 1, state programs carried out under Section 4 of the Assistive Technology Act of 1998. Number 2, programs carried out by the Undersecretary for Rural Development of the Department of Agriculture. Number 3, non-educational agencies serving out-of-school youth. To clarify number 3, many of these will be nonprofit organizations, but could also include the Department of Corrections, for example. Number 4, state use contracting programs. To clarify number 4, these are self-supporting programs that manage contracts of vendors that provide employment specifically for people with disabilities. It is the state program that is designed similarly to the federal Ability One program. Not all states have these programs. If not, you should enter not applicable in the text box for this part. Number 5, state agency responsible for administering the state Medicaid plan under Title 19 of the Social Security Act. Number 6, state agency responsible for providing services for individuals with developmental disabilities. Number 7, state agency responsible for providing mental health services. Number 8, other federal, state, and local agencies and programs outside the workforce development system. To clarify number 8, one example could include the Centers for Independent Living. And number 9, other private nonprofit organizations. Next, you'll hear again from April Trice.
Thank you, Shelley. Let's talk about state plan assurances. The VR services portion lists the 7 assurances specific to the VR program. The following assurances no longer require a yes or no response. Assurance 3B, Independent State Commission or State Rehabilitation Council or SRC. Assurance 3E, Local Administration of the VR Services. Assurance 3F, Shared Funding and Administration of Joint Programs. Assurance 3G, Waiver of Statewideness. And Assurance 4C, able to provide all eligible individuals a full range of VR services. VR agencies are required to review the VR services portion of assurances to verify that the information accurately reflects the current status of the VR program. VR agencies will have a yes or no option in the state plan portal. Do you attest that these assurances will be met? Let's turn our focus to state plan certifications. The VR services portion lists 9 certifications specific to the VR program. VR agencies are required to review the VR services portion certifications to verify that the information accurately reflects the current status of the VR program. Certifications now clarify that the designated state unit, or if not applicable, the designated state agency has the authority to operate and is responsible for the administration of the VR program in accordance with 34 CFR Section 361.13b and C. Numbers 1, 2, 7, and 8 require the agency to enter information which should match the signature in the certification table. The individual with the authority to sign the state plan must sign the VR services portion certifications within the state plan portal. Example, the director of the designated state agency or the designated state unit when the designated state agency has a designated state unit. When developing this description, states must consider the following. The name of the VR agency must be included in numbers 1 and or 2. The name of the VR director is required for number 7. The VR director's title must be included in number 8. And the director of the VR agency is required to sign the plan certifications. I will now hand things over to Jim.
Thank you, April. Next, we will discuss a new requirement for the VR and supported employment programs, the General Education Provision Act, or GEPA forms. This is a new requirement for VR agencies, but not for the Department of Education. The Adult Education Program under OCTAE, or Title II, has been required to collect this information from its grantees as part of its state plan. However, the form has changed since the 2022 state plan submission. Each VR agency will need to complete 2 versions of this form, one for the VR program and one for the supported employment program. If the VR agency does not accept its supported employment awards, both SEA and SEB awards, the supported employment GEPA form would not be necessary, but still must submit the GEPA form for the VR program. Please note the VR agency must identify that it will not be accepting its supported employment awards in its state plan before this could occur. RSA is currently working to have this form included in the portal for agencies to complete and submit to RSA with the VR portion of the state plan. These forms will be required every 4 years with its new state plan submission and at the submission of the 2-year modification of the state plan. The VR agency will need to identify all barriers for items listed above for its VR and supported employment programs separately. In addition, the VR agency would need to identify what steps have already been taken to address these barriers if they have already implemented processes to reduce one or more of these barriers. If no barriers exist, the VR agency must explain why and what action it has taken in the past to overcome each barrier. When appropriate, the VR agency may point to how it addressed or plans to address these barriers if discussed in one or more descriptions of the VR portion of the state plan, by including the specific description and section of the state plan. For example, under description B2II, please be specific. The information above includes each of the prompts the VR agency must address for its VR and supported employment program when submitting the GEPA forms. As mentioned before, RSA is currently working with the contractor for the state plan portal to have these forms included as part of the VR services portion of the state plan. It is suggested that the VR agency examine its program and identify additional barriers that may still exist and the steps that will be taken to overcome each area while identifying the timeline and targets it will use to assess its progress. Presenting next, Michelle will review the performance indicator section.
Thank you, Jim. I'm now going to share information regarding the WIOA performance indicators. States must submit expected levels of performance in their unified and combined state plan and in the 2-year modification of the plan. Expected levels, which are projections developed by states, are due within the state plan by mid-March. In order to satisfy these requirements and deadlines, the state should not wait for the release of the latest estimated levels of performance derived from the department's statistical adjustment model. If a state has 2 VR agencies, they must collaborate and submit only one expected level of performance for each indicator. Please note, expected levels of performance must be stated to the nearest 0.1% or to the nearest whole dollar for median earnings. Prior to plan submission, the expected levels of performance must be published for public comment in accordance with state law, regulation, and policy. After submission of the plan, each state VR program and each state with 2 agencies must reach an agreement with RSA on the negotiated levels of performance for the indicators for each of the first 2 years of the unified and combined state plan, or the 3rd and 4th years of the required 2-year modification process. The RSA data unit will apply its statistical adjustment model to determine pre-program year estimated levels of performance for each indicator. RSA anticipates estimated levels will be shared with states in mid to late February. A performance negotiations tool will be finalized by the RSA data unit by the end of March. The published tool will provide states with historical data and perspective across all indicators at both the state and agency level. During the negotiation process, both RSA and the state VR program will take into consideration the factors outlined in WIOA Section 116B3AV. RSA will communicate proposed negotiated levels to respective state directors by April 1st. By mid-April, directors should confer with appropriate parties and either accept proposed negotiated levels or request a meeting for further negotiations. Negotiated levels will be finalized before a plan is approved. From mid-April through no later than June, RSA staff will finalize negotiations with states requesting consultation. Once negotiated levels of performance are agreed upon, each state must incorporate the negotiated levels of performance into the unified and combined state plan and the 2-year modification of that plan prior to the plan's approval. This is in alignment with Section 116B3AIV of WIOA. As we continue our conversation about WIOA performance indicators, please note that as in previous plans, 5 of the 6 performance indicators will be included in this state plan. As mentioned earlier in the training, the departments have not issued the final rule defining effectiveness in serving employers. As a result, states will not submit expected levels of performance for this indicator, and the departments will not establish negotiated levels of performance for program years 2024 and 2025. Effectiveness in serving employers will continue to be marked as not applicable in the portal. Displayed is an example of the table where states will indicate the expected and negotiated levels of performance for each performance indicator. The table begins with the performance indicators listed in the first column. They are employment second quarter after exit, employment fourth quarter after exit, median earnings second quarter after exit, credential attainment, and measurable skill gains. Although effectiveness in serving employers is included on the table, as I mentioned earlier, states will not submit expected levels of performance for this indicator, and the departments will not establish negotiated levels of performance for program years 2024 and 2025, and it will be reported as not applicable. The remaining 4 columns include the expected and negotiated levels of performance for program years 2024 and 2025 for each of the performance indicators. It may be helpful to use this example as a reference with regards to formatting. For example, decimal places are not required for the median earnings measure. Next, I'll hand it off to Shannon.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's discuss the common elements of the Unified and Combined State Plan. As a core partner program, the Title IV VR program must participate in the development of the common elements and must be represented in the overall strategies of the state. The goal is for states to think strategically as a whole and not silo out each title's individual work. The VR program does not have to be called out by name in every element, but VR agencies should ensure that the VR program is included in all elements that describe collaboration and coordination efforts. This is an opportunity for VR agencies to contribute to the strategies of the state. For instance, under 2B, State Strategic Vision and Goals, individuals with disabilities and how they will be served should be included in the goals for achieving the state's vision based on the analysis of the state's economic conditions, workforce, and workforce development activities. More training on the common elements of the Unified and Combined State Plan will be provided later this year in preparation for the upcoming PY 2024 State Plan submissions. Thank you so much for attending the Rehabilitation Services Administration RSA training on the requirements for submission of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Unified and Combined State Plan for program year 2024, which included the redesigned Vocational Rehabilitation VR Services portion of the state plan. As mentioned previously, the PowerPoint presentation associated with this training will be located on the National Clearinghouse of Rehabilitation Training Materials, NCRTM website. A link to this PowerPoint is available in the YouTube description below. Please send any questions related to this training to your RSA State Liaison.